Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. You know, in the light of recent events across the globe, it's not surprising that everywhere I go, people are talking about the amazing increase in natural disasters. You know, they're also perplexed about the political chaos in the Muslim nations, especially those surrounding Israel. On top of that, they're worried about the economic problems sweeping the industrial world that may soon cause the collapse of world currencies, like the dollar and the euro. Even people who know nothing about Bible prophecy are asking the question, are we headed toward the end of the world as we know it? Jesus Christ himself warned of just such a time as the one we see unfolding before our eyes. In his last and most important prophetic message, recorded in Matthew chapters 24 and Luke chapter 21, the Lord Jesus gave a list of signs to watch for that would signal the end of this age. His disciples asked him for the signs of his coming and of the end of the age. Jesus then predicted that a number of special signs would all appear together in the same time period. And these signs began to appear in earnest when Israel was reborn as a nation in 1948. Parenthetically, nothing in the way of signs of the end times was relevant until Israel was reborn as a nation, because every one of these assumes that Israel is restored as a nation. Now, they include in these lists of what we call the signs of the times, rampant religious deceptions against the Bible truth, hot wars and cold wars, ethnic groups rising against ethnic groups, kingdom against kingdom. He also said in various places there would be famines, plagues, and great earthquakes, and finally, strange signs from outer space, 8 in all. Then Jesus compared these signs to those of a woman in labor before childbirth. He said the prophetic signs would be like a woman having birth pains. They would all increase in frequency and intensity as time for their fulfillment drew near, just as a woman's birth pangs grow more frequent and intense the closer she gets to delivering her new baby. Without debate, this is the first time in history all of these signs have appeared together in the same time period and increased so rapidly in frequency and intensity, all against the background of a reborn state of Israel. Now let's take a look at how these birth pangs are increasing exponentially. If there's any one particular sign associated with the last days and the return of Christ, it is earthquakes. As I just noted, one of the great indications of the last days given by Jesus Christ is there will be great earthquakes. This sign is so important that whole ministries have dedicated themselves to proving the link between increasing seismic activity and the end times. Until recently, it could be argued that evidence was somewhat ambiguous. Earthquakes appeared to be on the increase, but there was some question as to whether it was true increase or merely a perceived one. The U.S. Geological Survey has devoted a special section on its website to debunking what it calls the misperceptions that earthquakes are on the increase. The USGS says the increased awareness is because of more advanced detection systems. They're practically dogmatic about it. In other words, they say that more advanced equipment and techniques allow us to detect smaller earthquakes in more remote places than ever before. Furthermore, improved communication systems like computers and the internet allow us to instantly report and share that information with anyone and everyone. So they say that there really aren't any more earthquakes than before. It's just that we are able to detect more of them and report them more efficiently than ever before. And there is perhaps some merit to that argument. However, don't you think that Jesus Christ probably took the development into account when he made his unequivocal statement to his disciples? Well, I do. And I think that Jesus knew that what was most important is not whether there really were more earthquakes, although there are, but that in the last days, the people would be more aware of all of the earthquakes happening around the globe. Of course, as you will see, the number of massive earthquakes is undeniably increasing. However, I believe that what is important about the predictions Jesus made is that the whole world will see the increase. And that has become possible only in this generation. And because the people of the world can now see it as it's happening, we've become anxious to the point of panic. But is it true that we're just simply getting better at detecting and reporting earthquakes? I think that's a fair question. There's one thing that even the seismologists agree with. Though the earthquake swarms of the 21st century have shot off the charts, like last week's great quake of Japan, the USGS first pegged the undersea earthquake at 8.9 on the Richter scale. Then the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center said it measured 9.1 for that quake. The quake toppled cars off bridges, split highways in half, collapsed buildings, and breached a nuclear power plant. The resulting tsunami, moving faster than a jet airplane, flowed like lava across the farmlands and villages, pushing waves of debris, boats, houses, cars, airplanes, trains, trailers, and people before. The earthquake struck at a relatively shallow depth in the Pacific Ocean, so it released most of its energy on the surface. Entire sections of the northeast Japanese coast have been literally obliterated. To place the power of this quake into some sort of perspective, consider these facts. The city of Christchurch, New Zealand, was devastated last month by a 6.3 quake that killed at least 166 people. 200 New Zealanders are still missing. The Japan quake was 8,000 times more powerful. The earthquake that virtually destroyed Haiti last year was a magnitude 7.0. The Great Quake of Japan was 5,000 times more powerful than that one. According to the U.S. Geological Survey's own definition, major earthquakes are classified as those registering from 7.0 to 7.9 on the Richter scale. Great earthquakes are those that register a 8.0 and above. However, the USGS says it usually expects 17 major quakes and one great quake per year. But earthquakes greater than 9 usually occur only about once every 20 years. The Great Japan Quake is the third 9.0 earthquake of the 21st century, and it's the 7th major earthquake of a young 2011, the 4th most powerful earthquake ever. I know this is a lot of information, but stay with me just a few more moments. Of the 10 most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the history of mankind, 6 have struck since the restoration of Israel in 1948. 3 of those happened during the past 6 years alone. Last week's great quake of Japan was so powerful that it ripped a gash more than 150 miles long and 50 miles wide in the crust of the earth below the Pacific Ocean. Reports from the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology in Italy estimated that the quake shifted the planet on its axis by nearly 4 inches. The quake moved Japan's big island of Honshu by more than 8 feet. The shift in the planetary axis also affected actual time. Almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus predicted that the most powerful earthquakes the world would ever see would occur in the last generation before his return. Out of all that time, 6 of the 10 most powerful earthquakes ever have struck within the lifetimes of many of us who were born before the rebirth of the state of Israel. Another interesting point to note is that God used earthquakes to highlight the supernatural aspects of the crucifixion and the resurrection. When Jesus breathed his last, an earthquake struck. Matthew wrote, "So when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, 'Truly, this was the Son of God.'" He also recorded that 3 days later, after Jesus was resurrected, behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. And in the related prophetic twist, the prophet Zechariah predicts that at the Lord's second coming, when his foot touches down on the Mount of Olives, it will generate a massive earthquake, and that timber will split the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem eastward to the Dead Sea and then southward to the Red Sea. It will also make a great chasm from Jerusalem westward to the Mediterranean. So what do we have here? This will make Jerusalem a seaport with canals that connect to both the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. This will happen in the thousand-year kingdom. Coincidentally, or not, it's also worth noting that the Israeli Ministry of Health recently distributed a letter to hospitals in Israel. The letter warned them to be prepared for a major earthquake. Interestingly, Israeli seismologists note that the Holy Land suffers a major quake about every 80 years or so. The last major earthquake struck that area in 1927. That was 83 years ago. Perhaps this is just another little reminder that Christ's coming must be very near. One of the most dangerous results of this catastrophic Japanese earthquake and tsunami incident may prove to be the panic generated by exaggerated reports about the damage done to the nuclear power station reactors. The fear of radioactivity being spread over the affected areas is frightening, to be sure. But nuclear experts are carefully analyzing all of the facts and reporting some reasons for hope. I received this report from an old friend of mine, early Christian days that I had here in Houston with Dr. Horace Sonny Coffer. He helped with the design of some of the best nuclear power plants in the world. He sent me a summary of the currently known facts about the most damaged Fukushima nuclear power plant. The report was prepared by the American Nuclear Society, which is composed of top nuclear scientists. Here is the sequence of events that occurred at the Fukushima I-1 power station. The nuclear reactor designed by General Electric was correctly and adequately constructed to withstand earthquakes of up to at least 9.0. It was built in early 1970s. Even though there are better designs available today, the unit operated properly and performed very well. However, it was not designed to withstand at the same time a tsunami of the power that accompanied this earthquake. Everything functioned perfectly after the earthquake. The nuclear reactor shut down immediately, as it was designed to do. When the electrical power to the computer controlling the valves that provide cooling was lost, the standby diesel generators were switched on and the electricity was resumed. That ensured that the nuclear fuel rods were properly cooled. But catastrophe struck when the massive tsunami waters damaged the diesel-driven generators and their fuel lines, and such a dual event was not anticipated, obviously, in the design. Even so, the Japanese engineers improvised sufficiently. Backup batteries continued to provide adequate power until they were expended about 8 hours later. After many hours, the primary water inventory was lost and core degradation occurred. That means that some of the fuel rods began to melt. New portable generators were rushed to the plant site. Electrical power was restored until cooling water for the core was finally exhausted. Then, as a last resort, raw seawater spiked with boric acid was pumped in to cool the fuel rods. One official said, "We think they have a core meltdown in one of the reactors, but because the containment hasn't been breached, it won't be anything like 3 Mile Island." Now, whether the Japanese can manage to keep cooling the fuel rods of the 6 affected nuclear power plants is still a frightening question. It takes 30 days to bring the fuel rods to safe temperature levels after an emergency shutdown. And with the massive destruction of all forms of transportation systems and electrical infrastructure in the area, the problem is almost overwhelming. And that's assuming there will not be more large earthquakes. Now, as of the taping of this show, it appears that 2 more of the plants have had a failure. All of this leaves many Americans with great concern over our own nuclear power system. But the American Nuclear Society assures us that the current American designs can keep a meltdown contained even in an electrical blackout condition. If America panics and shuts down our nuclear power plant programs, we will be driven in further to dependence upon unstable oil cartels. This does not leave us with easy choices in the energy-driven world in which we live. We need to pray as never before for our country and bear a hope it's time for the Lord to return and put this world under His management. I'll be right back after this. Another important birth pang Jesus predicted as a sign that His return is near is famine in various places. Jesus predicted that this would come at a time when the love of many will grow cold, and because of the increase in wickedness. The United Nations is now blaming the unrest sweeping the Middle East and North Africa on the growing global food shortage. As one of its functions, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization tracks the global cost of a basket of typical food staples. It recently calculated that after rising for 8 consecutive months, the cost that a basket of food staples has reached an all-time high. When the UN first began tracking the global food basket costs, the index averaged around 90 points. It's currently at 236 points and rising. The United Nations blames climate change for the storms, droughts, and fires that have devastated crops around the world. Then it blames efforts to combat climate change, such as adding ethanol to gasoline, for restricting food supplies even more. The amount of food grains necessary to create enough ethanol to fill a 25-gallon automobile fuel tank would feed a person for a year. 1/6 of all of the grain grown in the United States this year will be industrial corn. That means it's destined to be converted into fuel for our cars. The environmentalists have been pushing a biofuel for years as a clean, cheap alternative to fossil fuel. They claim fossil fuels are ruining the environment. In the 1970s, the environmental activists fought against the expansion of nuclear energy. In the 80s, they opposed increasing the number of oil refineries. In the 1990s, they fought against expanding our domestic oil exploration efforts. They kept insisting that biofuels were the solution to global climate change. The upshot of all their concern for saving the planet is that it comes at the expense of literally starving the excess population. Unfortunately, the Greens don't really have a problem with that. Of course, for appearance's sake, they pretend to be concerned. You see, the environmental movement has its roots in the New Age. That deceitful belief system sees man as a cancer on the planet. Some environmentalists claim that the only way to save the earth is to reduce the total population to around 500 million people. Don't take my word for it. Dave Foreman, co-founder of worldwide radical advocacy group Earth First, thinks even 500 million is too many. He said, My three main goals would be to reduce human population to about 100 million worldwide, destroy the industrial infrastructure, and see wilderness with its full complement of species return throughout the world. The Club of Rome is a global think tank founded in 1968 to deal with a variety of international political issues. It described itself as a group of world citizens sharing a common concern for the future of humanity. The club consists of current and former heads of state, UN bureaucrats, high-level politicians, and government officials, diplomats, scientists, economists, and business leaders from around the globe. In 1993, the club published a book entitled The First Global Revolution. In it, the club states, all these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. The earth has a cancer, and the cancer is man. The Club of Rome concluded, the resultant ideal sustainable population is hence more than 500 million, but less than 1 billion. Today, the Earth's population is approaching 7 billion. These guys would like to pare it down to 1 billion or so. Coincidentally, we're now putting food in our gas tanks instead of oil while the third world starves. If that's the plan, then the Lord certainly had it right. Mankind's love can't get much colder than that. Another important prophecy related to the signs of famine is in the book of Revelation. It predicts how severe this situation will ultimately become in the tribulation. The first 4 judgments of the tribulation are depicted as the 4 horsemen. The third horseman is the rider on the black horse. This image evokes a sense of where our world is soon heading, a global famine. Revelation chapter 6, verse 6 says, and I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. According to the latest statistics from the United Nations, more than 1 billion people living on this earth today do so on $1 a day or less. They qualify as poor. Those persons living on $2 a day are classified as middling poor. In the United States, the federal poverty threshold for a single American is $10,830 per year, or almost $30 per day. To be poor among the billion richest is to be at least 28 times richer than the standard for poverty among the billion poorest. To be rich among the top billion is a status of unimaginable wealth. In the Apostle John's vision described in the book of Revelation, the third horseman on the black horse holds in his hand a pair of balances. He represents famine, but also represents the distribution of the world's wealth as it will exist in the last days of what is called the tribulation. A measure of wheat or 3 measures of barley represents a day's rations, and a denarius was a day's wages for the average person of that time. That means a day's wages will purchase a bare minimum of food. The oil and the wine were items of luxury representing great wealth. These are not even considered as part of the vast majority's food ration. Today, for the world's poor and middling poor, a day's wages may not even buy a quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley anymore. So the economic dynamics necessary for the rider on the black horse to mount up and begin his ride are already well entrenched. We awoke last weekend to news of yet another massive earthquake. This one struck near Concepcion, Chile's second largest city. The quake measured 8.8 on the Richter scale, making it one of the most powerful in history. One of my dear friends, Hans Joachim Bolton, lives in Chile about 500 miles south of the epicenter near Osorno. He said he was violently shaken in his bed, even that far away. It was so strong that it spawned tsunami warnings as far away as Australia and Japan. As we tape this show, more than 1,000 are confirmed dead, and it's estimated that more than 500,000 homes are destroyed. This massive Pacific Rim earthquake, coming so close on the heels of the Caribbean earthquakes centered in Haiti that claimed 225,000 lives, revived a debate that has been ongoing for at least 4 decades since I wrote The Late Great Planet Earth. Indeed, while Japan was bracing for the impact of the expected Chilean tsunami, it was itself rocked by a 7.0 earthquake that seismologists say was unrelated to the Chilean one. Back in 1969, I wrote that one of the most important signs given by Christ for the last days would be an exponential increase in more deadly earthquakes. Back then, I noted that there was already a marked increase in earthquake activity going back to the restoration of Israel in 1948. But the increase in both frequency and intensity of earthquake activities as we approach the dawn of the 21st century is so pronounced that this week, even secular Newsweek magazine was asking the question, are earthquakes getting worse? The focus of the article was, of course, skeptical. Newsweek quoted J. Ramon Aerosmith, a geologist at Arizona State University. He said, from our human perspective, with our relatively short and incomplete memories and better communications around the world, we hear about more earthquakes and it seems like they are more frequent. But this is probably not any indication of a global change in earthquake rate of significance. Probably not. Some say that the number of earthquakes has not increased, but that because of improved technology and communications, we can detect more of them and report them instantly and in an organized fashion. So it just appears that there are more. I don't believe that. But even if that is true, the net effect still fulfills prophecy. The Bible says that in the last days, one of the special signs would be an increase of great earthquakes in various or many places. Well, however it happens, the Bible says that the world will be intensely aware of this increase in great earthquakes. Even if the numbers have remained the same because of the exponential increase in knowledge in these days, we can see and hear about more earthquakes than at any time in history. This causes anxiety and perplexity to increase. We're now more aware of their occurrence and can instantly see worldwide their destructive power, just as the Bible prophets predicted. And there is one fact that is definitely unique. Of the 22 deadliest earthquake years in all of history, 8 have occurred since 1948. In the first 2 months of 2010, it is already the 5th deadliest earthquake year in history. Now, if that doesn't represent a change in earthquake activity of significance, one wonders what would qualify as significant. Each week on the Hal Lindsey Report, I try to show you how today's events are bringing to life the predictions of the ancient prophets. Like a watchman on the wall, I'm warning you that time is short. Christ will soon return for his church, and I want you to be ready to go. And I want you to see how urgent it is that you make certain your family, your friends, and those around you are ready to go too. Please help me continue this work and help me take the necessary steps to broadcast the Hal Lindsey Report into more homes in America. I need your help now more than ever before.
To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470-470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.
In Luke chapter 21, Jesus was asked two questions by his disciples. When would the destructive things he had just mentioned happen in Jerusalem? And what would be the signs that the end of the age was near? And this is what he answered. In Luke chapter 21, verse 8, he said, "Take heed that you not be deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time has drawn near. Therefore do not go after them." The first sign is religious deception would increase. Then in verse 9, the second one, "But when you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately." Now, we've seen wars and revolutions as at no time in history during the 20th and moving into the 21st century. And yet he said that would be the buildup, but it wouldn't be the end. And then he goes to the third sign. And then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation." The original Greek, the word nation is ethnos, and it literally means ethnic. In other words, ethnic groups would rise against ethnic groups. And then kingdom against kingdom. In other words, there would be divisions along ethnic lines that would be at conflict with each other, and there would also be the nation states and the combinations of nations, kingdom against kingdom. Well, certainly we've seen this happen all over the world, and it continues to increase. And then he says in sign 4, "And there will be great earthquakes in various places." You know, I looked up in the Greek, in various places. This can also be translated in many places. And the word megalos is used here before earthquake, which means great in the sense of tremendous magnitude. In other words, great earthquakes would increase in many places around the world. Now, this indicates that there would be an increase in ability for the world at large to know very quickly when earthquakes, no matter where they are on the planet, take place, thus greatly increasing anxiety. Now, we go on. "And there will be famines." And because of the disruption of revolutions, because of the increase in population and civil wars, famines are taking place in many places. And now natural disasters are beginning to cause famines. And he says, "And there will also be," sign number 6, "pestilences." This word loimos means plagues or the spread of virulent diseases. And certainly we're beginning to have fear of that, and it's being reported all the time, like the swine flu warning. Sign number 7, "There will be fearful sights." When in history has the world been able to see the troubles of the earth and great catastrophes and to see them almost when they happen? See, this anticipated that there would be television and satellites that could broadcast around the world the fearful sights that go on all over the world all the time. That is also increasing the sense of insecurity and anxiety. And then he says in sign number 8, "There will be great signs from heaven." Now, that's at the end of verse 11. And verse 12 starts a big parenthesis in this message of Jesus, because it says, "But before all these things," that is, before all of these signs happen, and then Jesus traces the things that would take place between his time and the beginning of the signs that would show we were approaching the end of the age. And so we have to skip to the next verse that picks up the prophecies that Jesus was giving in verse 11. He says that there would be great signs from heaven. Well, now, verse 25 picks that up. Now, there will be great signs from heaven, verse 11. And verse 25, there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars. In other words, there's going to be a great increase and troubling signs that are not understood coming from the cosmic universe. And then he gives another sign. He says, and on earth, distress of nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves. Now, the Greek word that is translated here, the earth will be in distress, is a word that is translated in the NIV as anxiety, or I should say anguish, because the Greek word means tremendous mental pain and physical pain, resulting in physical pain. So there's going to be this great anguish on the earth. And perplexity. Perplexity is a Greek word that in the original, aporia, it means, as the word in the English dictionary rightly says, the inability to accept and understand a complex, threatening thing that's going on. And it causes tremendous anxiety from this perplexity of things so momentous and inescapable that it just can't be accepted. You see, the world has rejected God. They don't want to believe that God is causing all of this. So they see these things that are before them. They see them coming upon them, but they just don't want to accept it because it means God is at work causing all of this. And so it causes tremendous perplexity. Now we go on to verse 25 where it says, in perplexity, why? Because of the roaring of the waves, or the sea and the waves. The word translated roaring is the word from which we get acoustic. It means a tremendous noise coming from the sea. And why? Because of the waves. And the word translated waves is salos. Salos is not just a normal wave. It means a violent rolling surge of waves. You see, this would be today what we know as tsunamis. In other words, it's a violent stirring of the sea, and you hear the sea turbulent and hitting the shores, and it causes this tremendous anxiety and perplexity. And then in verse 26, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming on the earth. Now, the word translated hearts failing really means that from fear, a person just stops breathing. In other words, they're so frightening. They're so frightened that they just stop breathing. And in some cases, it means that they are in dread. In other cases, it means that they die. They're so frightened they just stop breathing and die. Now, this is going to be caused by things never before seen. You know, I don't believe that man is creating the weather changes and the climate changes and so forth. However, I do believe they are taking place. But climate change and natural disasters are coming not from man's doing, but from God. And it's only going to increase. And that's why it says that in the final thing, that there is going to be men's hearts failing from fear and expectation of those things which are coming upon there. In other words, there's this tremendous, inescapable dread based on what they see of what next is coming. In other words, fearing that which is coming that'll even be worse. And so it says, for the very powers of the heavens will be shaken. Folks, we're well into this. 2 years after the 1929 stock market crash set the stage for the Great Depression, a severe drought turned the American Midwest into a giant dust bowl. Worst hit was Oklahoma. By 1931, tens of thousands of Oklahomans, who became nicknamed Okies, fled the mountains of rolling dust which turned midday into midnight, and they jammed Route 66 on their way to California. Many of them settled in the fertile San Joaquin Valley in the heart of the state. Now, ultra-liberal environmentalists are recreating the scene. Parts of the San Joaquin Valley are being transformed into a new dust bowl by an act of Congress. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 gave government agencies sweeping powers to protect animal species in danger of extinction. As a result, hundreds of thousands of acres now lie fallow, while almond and plum trees are left to die in the scorching sun. Tens of thousands of people have been deprived of work. The town of Mendota has an unemployment rate of up to 40%, and the line for food donations stretches down the streets. The reason? Despite the fact there hasn't been enough water to go around the last few years, the federal government decided to further restrict the water flow in an effort to protect a teeny bait fish. During the years of the Great Depression, federal and state irrigation projects helped turn the valley into some of the richest farmland in the world. Then the environmentalists discovered that the dams, canals, and levees were damaging the habitats of a variety of fish and other water creatures. The area, including the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, is a massive wetlands that contributes to the salmon fishing industry and provides some of the richest farmland in the world. Though the Delta is home to 22 species of fish, in 2004 it was discovered that a 3-inch long bait fish called the Delta smelt was on the edge of extinction. In 2006, in a decision driven by a lawsuit filed to protect the fish, the federal government agreed to divert 150 billion gallons of water away from the farmers southeast of San Francisco to save the Delta smelt. Much of the fresh water that used to irrigate the San Joaquin Valley now flows under the Golden Gate Bridge and out into the Pacific Ocean. On June 4th, the National Marine Fisheries Service also decided that delivering water to farms in the San Joaquin Valley would harm killer whales in the Pacific. Despite an ongoing drought in California and an effort to save the whales, the administration is now demanding even greater water restriction beyond what has been diverted for the smelt. There are 130 animal species in California on the federal endangered list, including 5 salmon, 5 steelhead, 4 trout species, and the North American green sturgeon. Not a single fish within the California water system has been removed from the endangered species list over the past 35 years. Now, this is despite massive amounts of water diverted to protect them. The smelt, the sturgeon, and the salmon population have continued to decline. It's not unreasonable to ask why San Joaquin farmers should continue to suffer if diverting water hasn't even helped the fish. The Congress is not helpless. If they wanted to choose families over fish, they could. It's been done before. Though the water flow to the western San Joaquin Valley was finally restored on July 1st, a spokesman for the Interior Department says that it recently declared the San Joaquin Delta as a precious natural resource, and as much so as the Florida Everglades. What that probably means to Central California's farmers is that the fish will still come first. You know what disturbs me most is the mushrooming power of the radical environmentalists under Obama's administration. They're driven by a non-biblical view that places the environment and animals above the preservation of human beings. This is one of the reasons why, even though we have ample recoverable oil, we're prohibited from drilling for it. Instead, we pour hundreds of billions of dollars into purchasing Muslim Middle Eastern oil, which has driven our trade deficits to perilous heights. And in the nation's breadbasket, we're damaging future production of greatly needed food. At the same time, we're putting tens of thousands of people out of work. It's frightening to think what the radical environmentalists may do with the growing power they're gaining under the current administration. They're not only going to continue to place the welfare of animals above that of humans, but they're attempting to gain global control through the dubious claims of man-made climate change. Some even insist on the need to eliminate large portions of the world's population before 2050. This is what happens when people with a godless worldview attain power. Thankfully, it will soon be time for the believers to leave these problems for them to solve, and you know what I mean. Until the early part of the 20th century, economic inflation was unheard of in the United States. In terms of purchasing power, the value of the U.S. dollar actually grew by 33% over the 19th century. What cost $1 in 1800 only cost 67 cents 100 years later. But over the course of the 20th century, the purchasing power of a single dollar began to decline. What cost $1 in 1900 cost $21.15 in the year 2000. Over the course of the last 10 decades, the U.S. dollar has been gradually replaced by what is called fiat money, money that is legal tender just because a government declares it to be. Until the Great Depression, the U.S. dollar was based on gold. A dollar was actually redeemable for gold. That meant the supply of dollars was limited to tangible assets possessed by the United States government. And since the supply of gold is finite, it meant that the supply of dollars was finite too. To finance the booming stock market in the 1920s, the Federal Reserve began issuing more dollars than there was gold on hand to back them. When the market crashed in 1929, inflation and the ballooning government deficits put even more money into circulation than there was gold to redeem it. By the way, in 2002, current Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke admitted that the market crash and subsequent depression was actually caused by the Federal Reserve. So to satisfy existing creditors and the Banking Act of 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered all privately held gold to be confiscated. Owners of the gold were compensated with new U.S. Federal Reserve notes, which promised to pay the bearer on demand in lawful U.S. money. The confiscated gold was then held in reserve to back transactions between nations. To finance President Lyndon Johnson's socialistic war on poverty and the Vietnam War, the Fed began printing more money. In the process, it devalued all the rest of the currency in circulation. As the deficits grew, national investors began to dump their dollar holdings. Foreign governments began demanding payment for their dollars with gold. By then, only foreign investors were given that privilege. Now, because of this, in 1971, President Richard Nixon was forced to make a critical decision.
To suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
He crossed the financial Rubicon by severing the link between gold and the dollar altogether. The U.S. defaulted on its payments. In the 1960s, the obligation inscription on Federal Reserve notes was changed again. The farmer promised to pay the holder with lawful money was replaced with the declaration, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." The promise to pay became the payment itself. It was backed by nothing of intrinsic value. As a direct consequence, the U.S. economy slipped into a decade-long slide. In 1973, Washington, searching for a way to bolster the dollar's value, cut an ironclad deal with Saudi Arabia. The United States promised to prop up and protect the Saudi regime in exchange for a Saudi pledge to accept only U.S. dollars in payment for its oil sales. Eventually, the rest of OPEC followed suit. The world had to buy oil, and since it could only be purchased with U.S. dollars, the nations and major corporations needed to hold U.S. dollars in reserve. That meant the Fed could go on printing fiat money. For the past 30 years, the U.S. dollar's strength has been primarily based on its role as the world's reserve currency. If you wanted to buy oil, the dollar was as good as gold. Even better, since greenbacks were easier to use. This may explain why U.S. presidents have had an almost inexplicable love affair with the Saudi royal family. The Saudi rulers could virtually do no wrong. They're given deference not afforded to any other national leaders. I've suspected that Gulf War I was staged primarily to protect the Saudi rulers, and most likely, even Gulf War II as well. Of course, it's also been to the advantage of the U.S. to protect our oil supply. Last week, the British newspaper, The Independent, published a startling report. It suggested an international conspiracy to end the dollar's supremacy in the international oil trade. The newspaper reported that officials from Russia, China, Japan, and Brazil had already held secret meetings to discuss plans. Apparently, our old allies, the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, and even France, are on board with the idea too. The various nations involved have all denied the report. But even if it is just speculation, the rumors themselves only fuel the dollar's continuing downward spiral. And now, the United Nations has also begun calling for a new global reserve currency aimed at ending the dollar's supremacy. UN Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Xia Zhukang, said important progress in managing imbalances can be made by reducing the reserve currency countries privileged to run external deficits in order to provide international liquidity. Now, in layman's terms, the international community is getting tired of financing America's standard of living at the expense of their own. World leaders have begun acting on their threats to dump the dollar if the Obama administration doesn't stop living on borrowed money. The president of the World Bank, American Robert Zoellick, recently warned that the U.S. should not take for granted the dollar's status as the world's key reserve currency. In Istanbul, for meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, Zoellick said,
"The old order is gone. We should not waste our time in tears lamenting it. Today we must build anew. Today we can put in place the foundations for a new normal of growth and responsible globalization."
For most of the past decade, the U.S. share of the international currency reserve market has held at roughly 63%. Since the administration began projecting budget deficits running into the trillions of dollars for the next 10 years, the dollar's market share has been cut in half to 37%. Recently, the Bloomberg Financial News has quoted analysts on Wall Street that say developing countries are dumping their dollars in favor of euros. Strategists at the Bank of America say that the current rate is running about $30 billion per month. The printing of all of this new money by the Federal Reserve is having an impact on devaluing each dollar. But that is without all of these other countries that are holding dollars in reserve dumping that money. The minute they start dumping that money, the result could be catastrophic. Reserve currencies become reserve currencies for good reason. They're trusted and are universally acceptable. Sometimes, though, trust slips away, particularly if the nation issuing the reserve currency starts overprinting fiat money and lending it to itself. That's like an individual printing counterfeit money and then borrowing it from himself. Someone is bound to catch on sooner or later. I'll be back after this break. We must admit that we mere humans are not clairvoyant. This is why the prudent leader carefully studies history. The best predictor of the future, apart from a divinely inspired prophet, is history. Therefore, successful leaders have always based their strategies for the future on a careful study of the past. We see this demonstrated every day in the business world. A business owner or corporate buyer bases his orders for the future on the record of past sales and profits. How much should we order for this season? Let's study the sales record for previous seasons. But when planning the defense of a country, knowing the history of a possible threat's motivations and actions is absolutely imperative. Those entrusted with defending the country must learn as much as possible about the strategies and tactics of potential enemies in order to ensure our security. For an elected official to play politics with the most solemn trust is tantamount to treason. The number one responsibility of the President and Congress is to ensure our defense against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In fact, this is a critical part of the oath each one swears to. It's for this reason that I make the following observations from well-proven current history. This report is based on Dr. Peter Hammond's book, Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, The Historical Roots and Contemporary Threat. The book is based on the documented history of the actions taken by Muslims who have immigrated to Western countries. First, it's imperative to understand that Islam is not just a religion. It's a complete, total system of life. Islam deals with the religious, social, legal, political, economic, and military facets of Muslim life. It is designed to control all aspects of a believer's life. This is why a Muslim feels estranged from his religion when he migrates to a different culture, especially in the West. He feels that he must change that culture to fit the Quran as soon as possible. This process, known as Islamization, begins when there are sufficient numbers of Muslims in a country to agitate for their religious privileges. When Western, politically correct, tolerant, and culturally diverse societies agree to Muslim demands for religious privileges, all the other components begin to creep in as well. This is the goal of all Islam as spelled out in the Quran, to subject all societies to the Muslim laws and way of life. Historically, here's how it works. As long as the Muslim population remains under 2% in any given country, it will be, for the most part, regarded as a peace-loving minority, not as a threat to other citizens. We see this as the case in, among other nations, the United States, where Muslims comprise 0.6% of the population, Australia and Italy, 1.5%, China and Norway, 1.8%, and Canada, 1.9%. At around 2 to 5% of the population, they begin to proselytize from other ethnic minorities and disaffected groups. Often much of their success derives from major recruiting in jails and prisons and among street gangs. This is currently happening in countries like Denmark, where Muslims comprise 2% of the population, the United Kingdom at 2.7%, Germany at 3.7%, and Spain at 4%. Once Muslims comprise at least 5% of a nation's total population, they exercise an influence disproportionate to their actual numbers. For example, they will push for the introduction of halal food. This term describes food considered clean by Islamic standards. They will increase pressure on supermarket chains to feature halal on their shelves. Failure to comply brings threats of violence. This very thing is occurring in countries like France, which is now 8% Muslim, or Switzerland, the Philippines, and Sweden at 5%, and the Netherlands, which is now 5.5% Muslim. But you may be saying, what about Jews and their requirements for kosher food? Have you ever seen threats of violence used to force stores or food service establishments to stock kosher food? Kosher foods and other ethnic or religion-specific foods are available because of popular demand, not legislation or threats. At this point, the Islamic minority will begin to work to persuade the ruling government to allow them to rule themselves within their neighborhoods under Sharia, the Islamic law. Remember, The publicly declared and ultimate goal of Islamists is the establishment of Sharia law with its underlying culture over the entire world. When the Muslim minority approaches 10% of the population, they begin to utilize violent demonstrations as a means of securing their demands. Paris, France has already seen car burnings and other aggressive outbreaks. Any action that is perceived offensive to Islam results in violent uprisings, including threats to the lives of individuals and public figures, such as in Amsterdam. Their political cartoons and documentary films about Muhammad have been declared an offense to Islam. However, such tensions and outbursts as these are seen daily, particularly in Muslim sections of Ghana and Kenya, India, Russia, and Israel, where Muslims comprise 16% of the population. After Muslims reach a 20% share, nations can expect hair-trigger rioting, jihad militia formations, sporadic killings, and burnings of Christian churches and Jewish synagogues, such as in Ethiopia, where almost 33% of the population is Muslim. At 40%, nations may experience widespread massacres, chronic terror attacks, and ongoing militia warfare, such as we've witnessed in Bosnia, Chad, and Lebanon. From 60%, nations experience unfettered persecution of infidels or non-believers of all other religions, including non-conforming Muslims, and sporadic ethnic cleansing or genocide with the use of Sharia law as a weapon, and jizya, which is the tax forced on infidels. In the last 2 decades, we've seen all of these characteristic actions take place in places like Malaysia, Albania, Qatar, and especially the Sudan. Then, with a Muslim population of at least 80%, a nation's citizens can expect daily intimidation and violent jihad, some state-run ethnic cleansing, and even genocide as these nations drive out the infidels and move toward the goal of being 100% Muslim. Some or all of these characteristics have made the news in places like Egypt, Gaza, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Morocco, Pakistan, Syria, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. But what happens when a nation reaches the goal of 100% Muslim? That will usher in Dar al-Salam, which means the house of peace. At least that's the promise. Here there's supposed to be peace because everybody is a Muslim. The madrasas are the only schools, and the Quran spells out the only acceptable way of life. That's the expectation promised by the Quran. What then is the reality in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, and Yemen, all of which are 100% Muslim? Historically, this promised peace has not been realized. And in these states, it's the most radical Muslims who rise to rule over the more tolerant and peaceful Muslims. Those who claim they are the most devout and pure followers of Allah inflict intimidation and violence on their fellow Muslims. One of the most obvious examples is the Taliban in Afghanistan with their public killings and beatings, especially women. It's also important to understand that in some countries with relatively small Muslim populations, such as France, Muslims live in ghettos. These ghettos have a 100% Muslim population that live under Sharia law. In such situations, Muslims do not integrate with the host population. Their children attend madrasas. They learn only the Quran. To even associate with an infidel is a crime that could be punishable with death. Therefore, in these areas, Muslim imams and extremists exercise much more power than the national percentage would merit, and they pose a much greater danger. Today's 1.5 billion Muslims make up 22% of the world's population, but their birth rate dwarfs the birth rates of Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, and all other religions. At their current birth rate, Muslims will exceed 50% of the world's population by the end of this century. These are the historical facts. I'm only trying to tell the truth. For Western nations to ignore them is a fatal mistake. For our leaders to ignore them is a total failure to do the job they were elected to do. I'll have more in a moment. Folks, many of you have been asking for it, so I'm very happy to announce the 2009 Prophetic Year in Review is now available. In this 53-minute DVD or CD, I review the major events and stories of 2009. I show how each one advanced the prophetic scenario for the last days. You'll learn how the election of America's new president, Iran, Turkey, Israel, China, the man-made global climate change scandal, and more contribute to the breathtaking pace of events as this age draws to its close. You can obtain the DVD for a gift of $25, which includes shipping and handling. Or you can also obtain the audio CD for a gift of $15, which includes shipping and handling. Simply ask for 2009, the Prophetic Year in Review. Send your requests and gifts to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also order online at hallindsey.com or by calling toll-free 1-888-RAPTURE. Order today. Here's an example of what can happen when a liberal Western culture fails to learn from history. Dutch Member of Parliament, Geert Wilders, produced a short film entitled Fitna in 2008. Fitna is an Arabic word with connotations of secession, upheaval, and chaos. It's often used to refer to internal divisions within Islam. Fitna has a secondary meaning in the Islamic eschatology not too dissimilar to the tribulation period of the Bible prophets. Fitna is sometimes translated as sedition, as in the Quran Surah 8:39, and fight with them, unbelievers, until there is no more sedition, fitna, and religion should be only for Allah. The film was labeled offensively anti-Islamic by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon after its initial screening. Prosecutors had initially declined to charge Wilders, citing freedom of speech, when it dismissed dozens of complaints over the film and a variety of public utterances. But an appeals court last January ordered prosecutors to put the MP on trial, saying politicians should not be permitted to make statements which create hate and grief. In its judgment ordering the prosecution of Wilders, the Court of Appeal wrote, "The court considers this so insulting for Muslims that it is in the public interest to prosecute Wilders." By attacking the symbols of the Muslim religion, he also insulted Muslim believers. In a democratic system, hate speech is considered to be so serious that it is in the general interest to draw a clear line. Wilders is charged with such crimes as having stated that Moroccan youths were violent, for calling for Dutch borders to be closed to all non-Western immigrants, and for advocating an end to what he terms the Islamic invasion. He also stands accused of 5 counts of religious insult and anti-Muslim incitement for describing Islam as a fascist religion and calling for the banning of the Quran. Wilders was even banned from entering Great Britain after Fitna was released on the grounds that admitting him into the country would threaten community harmony and therefore public security. Wilders is the leader of the Dutch Party for Freedom. By the way, just a few years ago, Wilders was the only MP representing his party. Now, the latest poll shows that come the next election, the Party for Freedom may win the most seats in Parliament of any of the political parties. Evidently, his views rang true with a large number of the Dutch.
My main message is that I have a problem with the Islamization of our societies. Let me tell you first that I have nothing against people, not individuals, not groups. I have nothing against Muslims. I know the majority of Muslims in our society are law-abiding people, and there's nothing wrong with that. I have a problem with the Islamic ideology, the Islamic culture, because I believe that the more Islam we get in our free societies, the less freedom we will get. I believe that our culture, which is based on humanism, on Christianity, on Judaism, is indeed better than the Islamic culture. I believe that people should also be proud to say that. You are not a racist if you say that you want our countries to adhere to our own culture. If you see how, what I said before, in many countries where the Islamic culture is dominant, homosexuals are beaten up or even killed. Journalists like yourself are often jailed for saying the wrong words according to the regime. Apostates are often killed. Yes, that kind of action indeed is retarded, and I think we should be proud that we have a more tolerant culture and society, and I want to defend that.
Never mind the voters, though. Before the court, Wilders has his work cut out for him. In his opening remarks to the justices, Wilders made an impassioned plea on behalf of the freedom he feels is threatened in his country. Of all our attainments, freedom is the most precious and most vulnerable. It is what people have dedicated their lives to and what people have given their lives for. I believe with all my heart and soul that the freedom is threatened in the Netherlands. That heritage is no longer a given fact, no longer a matter of self-evidence. I know that the words I use are sometimes tough, but they're never reckless. I have nothing against Muslims. I have a problem with Islam and the Islamization of our country, because Islam is at right angles to freedom. It is not only the right, but also the duty of free people to speak out against any ideology that threatens freedom. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, was right. The price for freedom is eternal vigilance. This trial is about the freedom of expression. It is certainly also about finding the truth. The statements I have made, the comparisons I have drawn, are they true? Because if something is true, how can it be illegal? This week, Wilders said, "I am being prosecuted for my political convictions." The freedom of speech is on the verge of collapsing. If a politician is not allowed to criticize an ideology anymore, this means that we are lost, and it will lead to the end of our freedom. However, I remain combative. I am convinced that I will be acquitted. If not, Wilders faces up to 2 years in prison for criticizing Islam. One wonders whether Wilders would be facing 2 years in prison for criticizing Christianity. Well, not with America's current upside-down political correctness. Today, criticizing Christianity in America isn't hate speech. It's considered courageous exercise and free speech. But it's much easier to be courageous when you know you won't get arrested or killed for it. Just imagine if a Christian immigrated to Saudi Arabia. He would first have to convert to Islam and forsake all symbols of Christianity, such as a Bible. And if he ever reverted back to Christianity and tried to proselytize a Muslim, as a citizen of Saudi Arabia, he could be sentenced to death. A very different standard, wouldn't you say? In closing, folks, I don't have a problem with Muslims or a prejudice against them, but I do strongly resist any religion trying to force, by intimidation, legislation, and every other means, their way of life on the host country and try to change their long-standing society and way of life. No other religion is allowed to do it, and this one shouldn't be able to do so either. God bless you, and God willing, I'll see you next week. Keep praying.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470-470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.